All right, so now that we have some of the ideas of data types and variables and that kind of a thing, I want to introduce you to this topic of pseudocoding. And the idea behind pseudocoding is it gives us a way to organize our thoughts before we start writing our program. In other words, when you have a problem, like if you want to build a house, the last thing you do is, okay, I'm going to build a house, and then you buy a bunch of wood and you throw the wood on the pile, and then you just start pounding things together, and oh, maybe there's a window that might go here, maybe I should leave a hole. The point is that you really plan ahead of time. You know, you have architects that come in and you really have to plan out the steps in which you want to build your house. You wouldn't build the frame of the house before you built the foundation. I don't even know anything about carpentry and building a house, but I'm pretty sure that those are important steps and that you make sure you do them in the right order. So when we write code, it's much easier when we write and develop software and we write and develop programs that we do it, we plan ahead. We figure out what is it that we need to do and what is it that we need to get from our users, what kind of calculations do I need to do, and what do I need to output. And we organize that before we ever just jump in and start trying to write code. And so pseudocode is a way for us to, it's an organized way in which we can start laying out steps of our code. So pseudocode is just that, it's fake code. It's not real programming language. It's not correct programming. You can't make this run like a Python program, but it gives us a way to organize our code. And the idea behind it then is that we can write out our code in steps. It doesn't matter then what language you're going to be writing in, because once you've got your steps organized and your steps laid out and organized the way it should be, it should flow, then you can take that pseudocode that you've written, sit down in front of a programming language, and now you get to worry about, okay, now that I figured out how it's going to work, now I can actually build it with the programming language tool. So pseudocode is a pre-step to putting it into a programming language. So let's just jump in and see how it looks. Okay, so the first word we're going to use is this word declare. Notice I've put pseudocoding, our keywords in pseudocoding in blue. So we use the word declare when we're setting up our variables. We talked about variables in a prior video. And the idea behind variables is that it's a storage place in memory. We've talked about that now. And we always want to say at the very beginning of our code, before we ever actually run the code, we want to set those allocations or memory allocations aside. So it's there for us when we're ready to use them in code. And it's always a good idea to declare or put all of your variables, your defining of your variables at the very beginning of your pseudocode, but also when you get into your language, because that way someone else reading the code can know ahead of time what kind of variables you're going to be working with. And so in other words, what we've done here is I've set up various variables by using the word declare. So I'm declaring that I'm going to use a variable called songs, and this variable is going to have the type int. So we're sort of setting aside, before we even get started, that bucket in memory, that memory space that we're going to call songs, and it's going to be an int, and we talked about that in a prior video. We've also declared price as float. That's another way to do it. So again, we're setting up a variable and the type at the same time. Or here's one, username as a string. So declare is the word we use to set up or define our variables and also give it the data type. So there's the word declare. We'll put this all together at the end. So let's just keep walking through this. We use the word write when we want to display something onto this monitor, maybe to write to a printer. In our cases, it's going to be displaying something onto our monitor. But the word write then is the word we use in pseudocode that says this is what I'm going to display to the screen. So it can be something literal. Remember we talked about strings. Everything within quotes is literally what's going to be sent to in this case, to the console. So we want to write this exact phrase, this exact sentence to the console. It could also be a combination that we've talked about with the join. So here is a literal string. Literally, I want the word hello. That's what's enclosed in the string. And join that with whatever value is in username. And that's what's going to be written to in our case, the monitor. So write is the word that's displaying information. We use the word input when we want to get something from our user. And so what typically happens, let me give you an example of that here. I think I have a screen that I can slide over. So what happens when we are talking about input is you can see here in this screen, this is input. We've used a write that's displaying information to the screen. And now this console is locked. It's just sitting there waiting, patiently waiting with that flashing cursor, waiting to receive information from the user. And so in this case, it's what's your name. So the idea here is that as soon as the user types in some information, the information the user types in is going to then be put into the variable that's next to input. So these two probably aren't the best example because they're not matching, but obviously, what is your name? If I put in Kirsten, that doesn't pertain to songs very well, but you get the idea, I'm hoping. So input says, wait to receive some information from the monitor, from the keyboard actually. When the user hits enter, whatever they put in on that keyboard then is going to go into the variable that I put next to the word input. So input says, get something from the monitor, whatever value is returned, put that into songs. So this is a way for us to get information from our user that we can utilize in our code later on. Okay? We use the word set when we want to assign a value to a variable. In other words, here we're saying set songs equal to 5. So I'm predetermining, I'm setting for sure I want songs equal to 5. So remember that variables always go on the left-hand side of this assignment operator. And what we want to assign to that variable goes on the right. So set songs, in other words, assign, I know these seems like it's out of order, but that's just the way it is. So assign whatever's on the right-hand side into this variable. Okay, it's kind of similar to the example we saw above where we said input songs, that we're getting information from our user and putting it into the songs variable. Here we're simply saying I'm going to set that to something. And in this case, we set it to a 5. We've decided ahead of time that it's going to be a 5 and that's what it's going to be. Here would be an example of we're going to do a calculation. And whatever the calculation is then goes into the variable. So in this case, set the dollar price, set the variable, assign whatever the calculation is on the right-hand side, and put that calculation into this variable. So what's done first is songs, which we decided above was assigned to 5. So 5 times 99 cents. So 0.99. Notice there's not the cent sign in it because then it's a string, right? So we need it to be, in this case, it's a float because it's a decimal. So the calculation is done first, 5, because that's the value that's in songs, times 99. Once that calculation is done, turns out that happens to be $4.95. That calculation then is put into this variable. So set is a way to put a value into our variable, whether it be, in this case, it's from either a calculation or one that we put in directly from we give it a specific value. That's what I'm trying to say. And as opposed to, let me see if I can go back, as opposed to input songs, in essence, it's doing the same thing. Songs is being assigned a value. The difference is that this value is being received from the keyboard. So in this case, if we put in 5 from the keyboard, songs would then be equal to 5. Similarly, in this example, songs is getting a value, but we're giving it that value, which is why it's set as opposed to input. Input means get the value from the keyboard, from input from the user, and set says, I'm going to tell you what to put in there. I'm going to provide you either an exact number, or we're going to create some kind of calculation, or we're going to get a value perhaps out of another variable. Okay, so that's the difference between set and input. All right, so let's look at some sample pseudocode. Okay, let's give you the problem first. I think I put the horse before the cart there. So here's our problem. It says, write a program that gets the number of songs from the user, how many songs they wish to buy. Perhaps that could have been worded a little better. But anyway, we're getting the number of songs from the user. We're asking them how many songs they wish to buy. And then we're going to calculate the total sales price. And there's our calculation. So the number of songs that they input times 99 cents. We're just going to say all the songs are 99 cents. So we don't need to get that from the user. We can just incorporate that in our code and display the total purchase amount back to the user. So first thing we do, remember at the beginning of our pseudocode, is we always want to set up our variables. We use the word declare. I also want you to notice that all of our pseudocode keywords that you've seen in blue are always the first word on each statement line, on each sentence. So the first one we're dealing with here is the word declare. So declare songs is int because we're going to be getting the songs from the user. So we need a variable storage location to hold songs. And we know that that's going to be an int. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a number of songs they want to purchase. Declare total. So total is going to hold our calculation, the number of songs times 99 cents. And so that's going to be a float because it's a decimal. And then we're going to get their username, and that's going to be a string. Okay, so we're going to declare our variables at the very beginning, and then we're going to declare what type, data type they are. Now, it's very possible as you're writing pseudocode that you might want to, oh, I also need a variable to handle such and such. Well, you can add that later. So it doesn't have to be something you know up front as you go along, but as you develop steps, you might think, oh, I need to add some more. That's perfectly okay. Okay, so the next line of our pseudocode is giving the user some kind of indication, a prompt. I think the book calls it an annotation, but it's a prompt to the user to let them know what is it that you, as the designer of this program, what do you want to get from your user? They have to have some kind of clue. They're not in your head. They have to have some kind of idea what it is you want from them. And so remember the word write is going to display something to the monitor. And in this case, it's an exact quote. So everything in the quote is exactly what should be displayed to the monitor. So we're going to display some kind of prompt to the user to indicate what we would like from them. And we would like to know how many songs they would like to purchase. So we're going to write that string to the monitor. Once we write that string to the monitor, we have to sit and wait, right? So that was input. We're going to ask the computer to sit and wait until they type in a number. And then whatever number they type in, we're going to put into our songs variable. So input songs. So if we do things in order, we can see that if this were a program that we were writing, we would write code that would set aside spaces in memory for our variables. And then these steps would be done in order that the computer reads it. And the first step then is to print out a prompt. And then the second step right after that is wait at the keyboard until the user puts in a number and put that number into our variable, songs. So let's see what happens next. So next, we want to calculate, now that we know how many songs the user puts in, we want to calculate the price, which is a simple calculation. I can't even get a word out. Songs, whatever values in songs, times, remember asterisk is times, 0.99. So that makes sense. Once that calculation is done, the total gets put into the total, this variable that we've called total, which is a float. Okay, so set total. Here we're putting a value into total, but instead of getting it from the user, we're calculating it based on what the user put in above. So now after this line is run, we have a value in songs, in our songs variable, and we've calculated a value in our total variable. So what comes next? Notice that we are also doing the input, processing, and output that you saw in one of the videos before. We're getting our input from the user, we're processing that input, and then we're outputting information based on that processing back out to the string, or to the monitor. Here we're creating a string, that we are joining together with the plus signs. We're joining a string that says you purchased. So that's all in quotes. That's a literal string. Literally, you purchased is what I want typed. Join that with whatever value is in songs, which is the value that the user put in. Join that with these literal words because they're in quotes for a total of, and then I'd like a dollar sign just to make it cleaner. And then join that with the total, with whatever value got calculated and put in the total field. So this is a great pseudocode example of a problem that at first is just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and then you pick it apart and put it into steps. Hopefully that input, processing, and output steps helps you organize what steps to put them in, what order to put them in, and how to organize them. And we've utilized, now we've got the perfect steps, so if and when we're ready to go to Python, which we're not going to do in this example, but we would have everything, all the logic is already laid out for us, and now all we have to do is finagle Python's language into the logic and the organization that we've already worked out. So one other addendum onto this sample, and that is I'm going to throw this at you. So notice this word declare price, and I purposely made it capitalized. We call this a constant, and what constant means is that 99 cents is not going to change throughout my code. 99 cents is always going to be 99 cents, and therefore I want to create what we call a constant variable, which means that I'm going to put a value into price, and I'm going to use that value throughout the code so that I don't have to, it's not something I'm going to get from the user. Why don't you just put 99 cents here? Well, I'll show you in a second. Let me also add the fact that price, because it's a constant, because I'm never going to change this value throughout the course of this program, it's always going to be 99 cents. Price constants are always capitalized. That says that this is a value that is not going to change. I'm not going to try and change it throughout the code. Some languages you can't even change it throughout the code. And then what I'll do then is replace this line with the word price instead of 99 cents. So I'm going to keep adding on to this because I know what you're thinking. So here we're making a constant variable that's going to hold 99 cents. And anytime we want to refer to that in our code, anytime we want to multiply something by our price, we're going to use the variable name instead of 0.99. And then you're going to ask me, well, why can't I just put 0.99 down here? Well, you can, but as you write more and more code, it's very possible that you're going to want to access that 99 cents more than once. In other words, you might want to calculate this line, maybe another time if it's you might need to alter or check on different prices. The point is that you might be using this value multiple times throughout your code as your code gets bigger. So if you write the word 99 cents here and then you do another calculation later in your code and you multiply that by 0.99 and you do that throughout your code, it makes it hard to maintain. Because what if 99 cents, tomorrow the code goes up to $1.04? So rather than having to go through your code and write $4, make all the changes through all of the places that you've utilized 0.99 cents, here you only have to change it in one place and it'll propagate itself throughout all of the other places in your code where you've used the word price instead of hard-coded or actually wrote out the number 0.99. Now you'd have to go in and change it all. So anytime we can use a constant, it's very helpful, and I want you to start thinking about that constant idea, that if it's a value that's not going to change, like tax rate, for example, would never change. So that's a good candidate for a constant variable. So that's pseudocoding, and that's an example of pseudocoding. We've looked at using the word declare to set up our variables. We've used the word write to send information output to, in our case, to the monitor. We're using the word input, which tells the computer to wait at the keyboard for the user to input a value, and whatever value they put in, put that number or that value or that string, whatever it is they input, into this variable. We've used the word set because we're going to also assign something into a variable. In this case, whatever's on the right-hand side is what we're going to assign into this variable. In this case, we used the value that was received from the input above, and we're going to multiply that by whatever's in price, which is our constant, which is 99 cents. And then we created a concatenated is the word. Concatenated means join. Do all of these joins, that's our fancy word. We created a long string by joining literal strings with our variables to create an output to our screen. Also remember that, or notice that all of our lines start with the blue keywords, our blue pseudocode keywords. They should all start off with that line, so that'll give you a clue on how to get your pseudocode set up. And remember that this is a very important cue, that pseudocode has to do with any programming language. It's just a tool for us to use to organize our thoughts and to print out in a logical way the steps in which we need to and/or create the calculations that we're going to need to do to solve the problems that we're given that we need to program. So in my next video, we'll do some example problems to hopefully help you work through this pseudocoding idea even more.